Okay, so, well, hello, greetings, hi. So, okay, hello, greetings, it's Thomas Daffern again. I'm doing a little special interview discussion with my friend who's visiting from Holland.
Yes.
In view of the catastrophic events in the British Parliament last night, which we both watched.
Yeah, and we were both shocked.
We were both shocked, really,
Yeah.
here in the centre of France, which is very laid back and peaceful part of the world, and you in Holland. Although you live in also in Bologna, don't you?
Yeah, I live in
Tell us a bit
Bologna,
about
yeah.
your life, and you seem to me a typical kind of modern European young woman. So
Might
tell
be.
me about your life.
I will shortly introduce myself. My name is Babette, and I have the honor to be a guest here at the Peace and Global Philosophy Institute, here in the beautiful area in France,
Right.
if I may say so. And I'm a student right now. I'm studying international affairs in Bologna, in Italy. And I'm originally from the Netherlands, and there I have done a bachelor in anthropology, where for which I had to do research and ethnographic research. And I've done that in Latvia on national identity and collective memory. And I've studied in different places in Europe, and I've been traveling a lot. And I guess for me that seems normal, but actually maybe it might be a privilege. And I would like to ask you some questions, if I may.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Just to sort of underline what you were saying, I just think that Babette is, to me, represents the common sense that we Europeans, want to go on enjoying from Britain. I mean, I know lots of Scottish, Welsh, Irish and English people. I've lived in all parts of the UK who've also travelled around Europe. I did as a when I was 26, I did the Interrail thing.
Yeah.
And I went to every European country I could get round within the month or something. And I love all of Europe, And that's when I went to Holland, I think, for the first time. And that's why I love the European Union, because it enables that mobility, that freedom of movement. You can come here from Holland on a bus and we can chat, and then you're going on to Bologna to go back to Italy, which you speak Italian, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you studied in Latvia for your research in anthropology.
That's right.
You did describe again what you were studying?
I was studying actually the Latvian national identity in relation to the Russian identity, or the Russians living in Latvia, while looking at collective memory, so how different groups of people interpreted the past, and we looked mainly at museums and statues and
cultural artifacts and things.
Yeah.
Well, that's very relevant to the whole Brexit debate and who is British.
Yeah.
Who the conflict between Scottishness, Englishness, Welshness, Irishness, etc. All these things. So I hope you'll go on and do a PhD eventually and all that. Maybe you can study Brexit as a kind of, an example, because it brings up all these issues, doesn't it? Okay, so go for it. You've got some questions for me. I'm all yours.
Yeah, obviously. You said you were shocked, but what were your other reactions to it while you were watching it? So you were watching it live, right?
I watched it live last night, which was September the 9th, when Parliament was ultimately shut down by this prorogation which I think is semi-legal. It's in a grey area. I think those parliamentarians, if I'd have been there, I would have been on the opposition benches, and I would have possibly said, there should be a sit-in, we should refuse to move. I think they're a bit sheepish. There was a bit of a protest, and they, some of the more lively MPs, like the MP for Kemp Town, where I grew up in Brighton, and Caroline Lucas, another Brighton MP, did sort of organise a protest, but then they sheepishly left, and Parliament shut now for 5 weeks.
Yeah.
I think that's
terrible.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
So my reaction was complex. It was, we shouldn't have got to this place. We should have outthought this strategically.
Yeah.
People that love Europe want Britain to stay in it and realise that it's in our best interest. We should have outthought these idiots, these hard right people. They're not that clever. And anyone who's got any brains could have seen this kind of thing coming.
Yeah.
So, that's one question, is how could we have outthought them? Dominic Grieve, who's a centre kind of conservative, liberal, intelligent ex-Conservative Party, he's had the whip removed.
Mm-hmm.
He has asked for the documentation about the prorogation of Parliament,
Yes.
because it's obvious that people like Dominic Cummings, these so-called special advisors, who come out of nowhere, as far as we the public are concerned, but they're kind of intellectual. Well, no, let me get this right. They're anti-intellectual elites who are working with Steve Bannon and the dark team, who are trying to bring a sledgehammer to destroy liberalism, actually, on our continent, and socialism, and anything that isn't sheer naked, aggressive, cutthroat capitalism. That's their mission. It seems to me. I mean, I'm just reading the readings. What makes these people tick? It's destructivist, and it's sheer thuggery, and yet they're very clever. Cummings is an Oxford guy, and they're misusing their intelligence to destroy. So we should have foreseen that and seen it coming. That's one reaction. It's like, why didn't I do more? I've done as much as I can. I've made weekly broadcasts. I've done fasting one day a week.
And the letters.
I've written loads of letters. I've written to the Queen, to the Prime Minister. I've set up a centre for Bremain studies. But still, here we are, and they shut Parliament down. I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah.
And what is it with do I have to move back to London and lead this kind of movement? It's ridiculous.
Yes.
So yes, shock, disappointment, guilt that we haven't done more, and just I'm appalled at the low level of discussion in Parliament. The Tory party especially, I think that someone, I can't remember who, it might have been Jo Swinson, who I thought spoke very well and eloquently. She complained of them baying and braying, or something, like donkeys,
Yeah.
They're just they're behaving like very badly educated public school privileged kids that think that's okay. You don't behave like that in a civilised society. You don't get away with that. If I was a teacher in a class, in a good school or any school, you don't let people behave like that. I think the Speaker's had a huge job to cope with this, and I think he's done really well.
Also, the debate itself, for me, it was. Of course, I've seen the British Parliament before. I've seen their debates, but for me, it was, especially yesterday, it was pretty rough or rude, which makes a lot of sense because it depends on a lot depends on it. But I thought the people were constantly interrupting each other, and but that's more about the debate itself.
Well, that's the style of rhetoric that's being used, and I'm disappointed in that. These are supposed to be educated people. I still believe, and I've campaigned for this, that politicians shouldn't be allowed to get to Parliament unless they've got a licence. You don't let a pilot fly the aeroplane unless they've got a licence. That means they have to have hundreds and hundreds of hours of training. They have to know all about engines, flight dynamics. You don't trust your life to a pilot who's just come out the pub and said, let me have a go, and he's half drunk. And yet we're doing that with our state. Our entire country is in the hands of semi-trained, privileged elites who think that they're entitled. It's this sense of entitlement. Boris Johnson, I watched his face and mannerisms last night. He's rude, as you say, and he guffaws at people. And you can tell that type. I've taught people like him, and I taught in very good schools in England. I've taught boys that have that attitude, extremely rude, arrogant and privileged. And they can't learn. That's not a path to philosophy and wisdom. Those are the kind of people who start wars.
Yes.
And my job as an educator is to chisel those hard edges off them and make them into proper human beings.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's interesting. My daughter went to Eton for a summer school. She was educated in a grammar school. She was gifted and talented and still is, and she was taught briefly by the English teacher who taught Boris Johnson. But I don't think they did a good job on his moral character.
No.
And I believe his head in his reports and stuff said as much. But that's not good enough. So someone like that shouldn't have a politician's licence. They have to have a good character. That was Plato's point. And also, if you lie habitually, as he seems to have done all his life, he's a liar, that disqualifies you from being in politics. You cannot have representative democracy. It breaks down if our elected MPs lie, because there's no trust between the people and the politicians they elect. And he's created, it's not just personally him, there is others. They've got this idea that it's fine to lie now, as long as you can't be caught or found out, or you can outspend their lawyers with your lawyers and never be convicted. I think this is an American thing, partly. It's happening in Trump's America. Yeah. And that's why I proposed the parliamentary veracity bill. So I was just watching the scenes last night thinking, my God, please make these people tell the truth by law.
Yes. And I have a next question. Does it mean that Brexit has won, or what do you think will happen next?
Well, I think that there's this 5-week delay. I think there should be legal challenges to that. I think that Dominic Grieve was right to demand the evidence. He alleged in Parliament yesterday, which is very serious, that Boris Johnson and the 3 Privy Council members who went to Balmoral to the Queen and said, here, sign here, prorogue Parliament, had acted in such a way as to deceive Her Majesty. They gave false reasoning as to why they wanted that prorogation. Now, and they've demanded, and Parliament has asked for, all the evidence about that. I think the minutes of that meeting should be revealed. I think Parliament should be entitled to continue with special committees, even though Parliament as a whole is prorogued. I think Parliament shouldn't have allowed itself to just go with that, be shut down like that. I think Parliament should have still stood and kept a committee running, functioning, and demanded to know the background data and details of the prorogation thing. I think there's much evidence that it was itself an illegal move. Yeah. Because for a start, it wasn't approved by the whole Privy Council. It was just 3 Privy Councillors came. Now, the Privy Council itself should have met, should still meet. I think it should still meet in emergency session and reconsider the prorogation of Parliament. And all the evidence and documentation about that was used to justify it should be submitted, but also to Parliament. Parliament is still there until they're still MPs and they still have their committees and the Speaker's still in place. So I think that inquiry should continue. Yeah. And if it's found that it was illegally done, then I think it should be annulled and Parliament should reassemble. So that's one strategy. Yeah. Yeah. No, I don't think Brexit has won at all. I think it's cheated. It's used foul means. It's probably deceived Her Majesty the Queen, told her porkies about why it's trying to do this thing. It's the end play, what they've done, of a long narrative that goes back to the referendum result in 2016. They interpreted that as if that was a clear and overwhelming mandate for hard Brexit of any kind, just out, which is a complete deception of the British people. Because Scotland, where I was living at the time and which I love, did not vote for Brexit. And Scotland is half the UK. Look at the size of the country. Scotland is half the UK. It has half the oil wealth and all the rest of it, and a lot of the water. It should have, and I listened with respect to the Scottish MPs last night. Yes. They were distraught at this. The Tories are, fanatically misinterpreting this referendum result of 2016 as if they have a mandate because the people voted. They didn't. That is a lie. So what I'm saying about lies taking over the culture of British politics, that's the root lie is that 2016 was an overwhelming mandate for a hard Brexit or any Brexit. It was a semi-mandate from some people,
Rather than it should be considered
advising.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was an advisory referendum anyway. Obviously what's happened is that I think offshore, very wealthy cartels, super rich, who've been, running the City of London as a sort of pirate enterprise since probably about 1610, decided that, rather than play by the rules of the European Union, which is a fairly civilised place, and through bitter wars and conflict, we've discovered that it's better to live in peace with our neighbours and not cheat, and on the whole tell the truth and all the rest of it. They seem to, the pirates running London, seem to have decided, and actually, by the way, they're not the mainstream City of London types, those are more honourable. These seem to be some sort of cartels that mostly are banking in places like the Cayman Islands and offshore, but using the City of London's infrastructure to rubber stamp their empires. The super rich I'm talking about. They seem to have financed Brexit. But I don't, I don't think they're going to get away with it. That narrative of falsehood that they imposed on us, enough people have seen through it.
Okay, let's hope so.
That's what I hope.
And I understand you're doing different work as an intellectual, for example, the World Intellectual Forum. And what do you think as a pan-European intellectual about this?
Well, yeah, thank you. That's a good question. Well, I think it's an affront to the entire history of European philosophy and intellectual life. I mean, my mother was a pan-European intellectual. She was a teacher of French studies and did her degree at London. She used to come to France in the holidays, and as part of her, like Erasmus in the 1930s, right?
Nice.
We've got photographs of her going around Austria and Germany and France back then. And she was someone on the left, so she was someone that, was part of the exotica of like Paris cafe society. I remember her bringing me and my brother and sister to France in the 1960s, and we would go to Paris and sit in the cafes and she sent me as a boy in my early teens to Paris every year for 2 weeks to learn French, staying with a French family. Yeah. Who were kind of intellectuals as well. And so pan-European intellectuals are my life background, and Mum's favourite author was Proust, who I also come to love. Proust, I discovered, used to go every summer, or a lot of the time, to a little Swiss village called Sils Maria, where he would bump into Rilke and William James and, Nietzsche even, who wrote many of his greatest books there. So, I love that whole tradition, and I studied European intellectual history at university. I was influenced by Sir Isaiah Berlin, who was from Lithuania, a Jewish guy, who was the greatest intellectual historian, I think, of the 20th century. Michael Ignatieff did a biography of him. Michael Ignatieff was the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada for a while, where I was born. So I've got this pan-European but also transatlantic view of stuff. And I love Europe because as a Canadian dual citizen, I could explore the whole thing, going to Rome, sitting in the Vatican Library, it just gives me a buzz, right? I love it. And going to Delphi when I was 26 and going to explore the old temples and where the oracles of Apollo and stuff were, and going to Eleusis where the mysteries were. That's my heritage. And that should be all our heritage. That's your heritage. You've explored all that, and no doubt will. Why would the people of England want to cut themselves off from that if they had any sense? That's what perplexes me. So I'm trying to get the European intellectuals throughout Britain, Scotland, people that think outside the box, like A.C. Grayling, my dear colleague, philosopher. He set up his own college, the New Humanities College in Russell Square, where my first office was in Bloomsbury, where I founded my Institute of Peace Studies, which was supposed to be part of the University of London. It kind of, at the moment it isn't, but intellectually we are.
Yes. And
A.C. Grayling and I, although we've never met, I feel his kindred spirit. He's the one philosopher in Britain that's 100% against Brexit, like me. And I discovered a book of his recently in Ljubljana in Slovenia, in the library, bookshop, on war, philosophical critique of war. Oh. It's a masterpiece. He only published it a couple of years ago. I didn't know it existed until I find it in Slovenia, right? Yeah. And he's done a really good philosophical critique of war. I've written parallel books on peace. So people like him, people like, I mean, every European country has amazing intellectuals still, writing, teaching, and they don't have to be in